Realism is one of the basic approaches to art. Along with expressionism, abstraction, and non-representationalism, it is one of the foundation approaches artists use when making art. So in order to understand this territory of defining art, we need to be clear about the difference between representational art and realism. Realism is about putting objects in space, in atmospheres, and doing it in ways which look like the world we see around us. The representational approach is making objects from the world around us, but in a way that is less faithful to the world we see around us than realism. And yet, although many people believe it to be so, realism, as we've just defined it, is not the foundation for all art. There are many other approaches that we find as we look at art across the globe. There are many countries that used other approaches to art than realism. Yet for many people in the West particularly, realism seems to be the foundation for all art. But this is actually simply a Eurocentric approach. Art has been created in many places around the world in many styles other than realism. So to believe that realism is the foundation for all art would be a mistake. So what is realism? Well, first of all, the approach we now call realism began in Europe during what's known as the Renaissance era in the late 1400s to 1500s. The thing that was most important in creating the approach we know as realism was the technique of oil painting. This invention of oil paint, or actually re-emergence, since primitive forms of oil paint had been used before, took place around 1410 in the Netherlands. And it's fair to say that oil paint allowed the technique of rendering to take place. And rendering technique was the approach of carefully blending paint together that made it possible to make smooth, gradual transitions from one tone to another. And it could be said that this rendering technique is the defining feature of realism. Most historians credit Jan van Eyck, a Flemish artist, as the artist responsible for establishing rendering technique in the West. Van Eyck's painting, done in 1434, known as the Arnolfini portrait, or the Wedding, is believed by most people to be the painting that began the re-emergence of oil paint and the introduction of rendering technique. Once artists got wind of this new approach, the rendering technique with oil paint spread around Europe. And one of the most important artists to take up the use of oil painting was Leonardo da Vinci. His skill and innovations with oil painting created many of the basic standards by which we measure painting today. Da Vinci had an abiding interest in the world around himself, and so used an approach that was much more naturalistic than any of the other artists of his time. Strange as it may seem, Da Vinci's approach to making his paintings very accurate to reality was the avant-garde art of its time. And in Da Vinci's time, it wasn't called realism. The term realism actually came into being in the early 1800s when Gustave Courbet and other artists of like mind began making paintings that were faithful to what they observed around them. This was the actual beginning of the term realism. As time passed, two general approaches to realism came to the fore. We could call these approaches strict realism and interpretive realism. Strict realism was the approach that tried to make things as much like they are in the outside world as possible. Interpretive realism allowed for more freedom and interpretation of form. Interpretive realism is more often than not called a representational approach. This Caravaggio painting from 1596 is an example of strict realism. The forms are done pretty much the way they are, with very little interpretation, and there's a strong attempt to not allow the brushstrokes to show. This El Greco painting from 1614 is an example of interpretive realism. In this painting, the forms are distorted and changed from how they actually are for expressive purposes. In the 1600s, two of the most formidable of the new kind of artists working with interpretive realism or interpretive rendering technique were Rembrandt and Vermeer. Many people believe Rembrandt was one of the first artists to develop a very personal voice. The important thing that defined his personal voice was his use of texture and a loose application to his paint. Johann Vermeer's paintings had an extremely soft and velvety quality. Because of that softness, they could be called interpretive realism. Raphael, in the 1500s, was more strict realism. Fuseli in the 1700s was interpretive realism. Grunewald, an interpretive realist, created forms so intense he's often called an expressionist. From the late 1600s to the early 1800s, an approach to realism surfaced, which was a new approach that became known as Romanticism. It was a strain of interpretive realism. The artists that used this approach emphasized sense and emotions, not simply reason and order. They also believed in individuality, individual imagination, and intuition, and brought these qualities forth in their work. It could also be said that these artists brought forth a loose realism approach that allowed letting the paint show, letting the brushstrokes show. This approach to realism diverged from Renaissance art in that the Renaissance artists wanted to hide their brushstrokes to heighten the illusion of reality, whereas the artists of the Romantic era, the 1700s and early 1800s, allowed their brushstrokes to show as an expression of their personal individuality. Their paint and their brushstrokes became signifiers of their individual voice. And this involvement with individuality, with individual voice, signaled something new in painting. It signaled the stressing of individuality and strong personal voice over an illusionistic presentation of reality. While the artists of Romanticism were making their extraordinary paintings, there were other artists who were painting in the strict realism style. They had become known as neoclassic artists. Nicolas Poussin painted in the 1600s. He considered himself primarily a painter of historical events. Jacques-Louis David was also a painter in the neoclassic style, who was also a painter of history. Jean Ang painted in the late 1700s and into the 1800s. He considered himself in the tradition of Poussin and David, and a painter of historical personages. In the mid-1800s, a movement emerged in France that became known as the Realism movement. The most prominent artists in this movement were Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, Gustave Courbet, and Jean Millet. The artists of the Realism movement were primarily concerned with how things appeared to the eye rather than romantic, ideal, or expressive representations of the world. James Abbott McNeill Whistler, an artist from Britain, was another artist who could be considered one of the realist movement artists. There was an American strain of realism. The most prominent artists of this American strain were Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins. Winslow Homer was an American artist who traveled to Europe and began to use an approach that was very similar to the realism movement in Europe. Thomas Eakins was an artist in Philadelphia. In the late 1800s, after Impressionism, realism came to refer simply to the use of a more traditional and descriptive painting style. In the 1900s, fewer artists were interested in the style of realism. Yet in the early to mid-1900s, one artist carried on with a style similar to realism. Edward Hopper used an approach which was like realism but more simplified and with a more abstract compositional bent. In the mid to late 1900s, Andrew Wyeth picked up the cudgel of realism in his own way. His more finished paintings had a very realistic bent. In the 1970s, a very talented artist named Tom Palmore began making realism-based paintings that were strongly infused with humor. It was around this same time that a movement began called superrealism. With this movement, there was a special interest in hyperrealism or hyper-detail. The movement is sometimes called photorealism because all of the artists involved with this movement tended to work from photographs. Many people believed their idea was to do away with personal voice. But as it turned out, this idea didn't really materialize. The artist's personal voice was still there. From the 1960s onward, Jamie Wyeth was one of the most powerful and interesting realist painters working. His paintings were often infused with fantasy. In the late 1970s and onward, Cindy Sherman began to do photographs that simulated realism. They were actually photographs of her dressed up as different people and different characters. Sherman's photographs were often blown up into a large size and had the flavor and sense of painting. Kenny Scharf often used realism's rendering technique in his somewhat popish, out-of-the-box paintings. In a similar way, Jeff Koons, also in the postmodern era, used rendering technique as part of his ammunition to bring a kitschy, campy kind of art to bear. These new postmodern artists were not about realism in the old traditional sense, but sought to find something new with the rendering techniques of realism.